Toy-stored warning. Edgar Cayce's prediction for 2026 is unlike anything we've seen, the forbidden map. What you're about to hear is a narrative built from hypotheses, interpretations, and perspectives that have never had official confirmation. We stand today at the edge of something most people are not ready to name. It is the closing days of 2025, and if you have been paying attention, truly paying attention, you already feel it. Not just in the headlines, not just in the weather maps bled red across your screen, and not just in the trembling fault lines that geologists keep quietly updating in their reports. You feel it somewhere deeper than logic. You feel it in the place where honest questions live. The quiet, persistent signal that something enormous is shifting. That the old rules, the economic rules, the geological rules, the societal structures that entire generations staked their lives on, are beginning, one by one, to fracture. You are not imagining it, you are not paranoid, and you are absolutely not alone. Nearly a century ago, long before satellite imaging, long before the internet made doomsday predictions a daily scroll, and long before the geopolitical fault lines of 2025 had names, a man in Virginia Beach sat down in a chair, closed his eyes, and entered a state of deep, unconscious rest. When he woke, he had spoken, in precise, clinical, eerily specific language, about a moment in human history that matches the one we are living through right now. His name was Edgar Cayce. The world knew him as the sleeping prophet. The desperate and the dying knew him as a medical miracle. But for those willing to look carefully at the full archive of his work, he was something more uncomfortable than either of those titles suggests. He was a man who appeared, by all available evidence, to have accessed information about our future that he could not possibly have possessed through any conventional means. For decades, scholars argued about his timelines. Many believed he was pointing to 1998, others fixated on 2012. But the geological data available to us today, the measurable magnetic drift of the poles, the tectonic stress accumulating along specific coastal fault lines, and the unmistakable social fracturing of the present moment, suggest something that demands we take a second look. The destination Cayce described may not have been those earlier dates. It may be now. The year 2026, according to a careful reading of his recorded sessions, represents not merely another number on a calendar, but what he called a tipping point. A moment when the earth, as he put it, stops whispering and starts speaking aloud. Today we are not here to talk about his medical readings. We are not here to debate dream interpretation or alternative healing. We are here to open what can only be described as a forbidden dossier, the earth change prophecies of Edgar Cayce, and to hold them up against the world we are actually living in. We are going to look at the map he redrew while in a trance state. We are going to examine his specific warnings for the West Coast, the East Coast, the capitals of Europe, and the two locations he identified as the unexpected safe harbors of the coming era. And we are going to ask the question that keeps millions of people awake at 3 in the morning. Where is safe? The answer, as we will discover, is not what most people expect. It is not a bunker. It is not a mountain compound. It is something far more profound and far more accessible than any of those things. But to understand the answer, we must first understand the storm. Teus Tesserudis, if this kind of deep dive into hidden history is what you came here for, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because what comes after this video will take everything we discussed today even further into territory that has never been publicly examined. And why should we trust the recorded visions of a man who died in 1945 over the supercomputers and predictive AI models of 2025? It is a fair and necessary question, and the answer is not a matter of faith. It is a matter of statistical record. Go back to 1929. The Roaring Twenties were at their peak. American financial markets were considered invincible. The experts, the bankers, the politicians, the economists, every credentialed voice in the room was predicting endless prosperity. Edgar Cayce, speaking in his sleep from Virginia Beach, described blood on the streets of Wall Street. He warned of a catastrophic break in the financial system. He was dismissed. 6 months later, the Great Depression shattered the modern world's first great confidence. In 1935, while the Western world was still nursing the desperate hope that peace might hold, Cayce described in precise terms the formation of the Axis powers, the rise of a particular kind of nationalist madness in Germany, and the inevitable outbreak of a Second World War, including approximate dates for both its beginning and its end. He foresaw the deaths of 2 sitting American presidents. He described the location of the Dead Sea Scrolls years before a Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave in the Judean desert, and found them. He outlined the splitting of the atom and described optical instruments resembling lasers at a time when both were the territory of pure science fiction. Cayce did not guess. He did not speculate in the way we use that word. He appeared to access something. In his own framework, he called it the Akashic Records, what he described as a universal field in which every event, past, present, and future, is somehow encoded. When we apply a biblical lens to what he was describing, it is worth pausing here. The scripture tells us in Proverbs 15:3 that the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. The idea that God holds complete knowledge of all things, past, present, and future, is not a fringe concept. It is the bedrock of orthodox Christian theology. Whether Cayce was truly accessing some permitted glimpse of divine foreknowledge, whether he was extrapolating from deep pattern recognition, or whether something else entirely was at work, the interpretive framework matters enormously. We are not here to crown him a prophet in the biblical sense. The scripture is clear that the office of prophet carries a weight of verification and accountability that no interpreter of Cayce's work has ever fully established. What we are here to do is examine the data he produced and hold it against the world as it currently stands. And what he produced across thousands of documented readings was a file marked for this specific moment in history. He called what was coming the earth changes, and he was unambiguous that these changes would be physical, geological, literal, and unavoidable. The question was never whether they would come. The question was what kind of people would be present to receive them. Before we look at the specific map he redrew, we need to understand the interpretive framework he offered. Without it, what comes next sounds like a catastrophe narrative. With it, it begins to look like something that has a purpose and a precedent. Cayce worked from three foundational principles that drove his understanding of why the Earth changes would occur and what they would ultimately mean. The first was that the Earth is not merely a geological object. It is, in his framework, a living system capable of response and reaction. He described human activity, war, greed, the systematic destruction of natural order, and what he called spiritual blindness as creating a kind of accumulated pressure on the physical world. When that pressure becomes critical, the Earth responds. When we translate this into biblical categories, it is not actually a foreign concept. Romans 8:22 describes all of creation as groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now, waiting for a redemption that encompasses not just human souls, but the created order itself. The idea that human moral and spiritual failure has physical consequences for the creation is woven through the Hebrew prophets. Isaiah 24 describes the earth defiled under its inhabitants because they have transgressed the laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. The earth reeling like a drunkard is not a metaphor invented by New Age thinkers. It is the language of ancient scripture. The second principle Cayce advanced was what he called national karma, the idea that nations, like individuals, accumulate moral debt. He argued, using the agricultural language of sowing and reaping, that a nation built on the exploitation of others or centered on unchecked material accumulation and spiritual blindness attracts a specific kind of accounting. The scripture is not shy about this either. Galatians 6:7 is direct. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. The prophets applied this law to nations without apology. The fall of Babylon, the judgment on Tyre, the reckoning brought to Egypt. In each case, the language of Scripture connects national moral failure to physical and political collapse. We do not need Cayce to tell us this. The Bible already did. But Cayce's contribution was to map it geographically onto the modern world. And that map, as we are about to see, is striking in its specificity. The third principle is the one that requires the most careful theological filtering, because it is where Cayce's framework departs most sharply from biblical ground. He spoke extensively about reincarnation and what he called the return of Atlantean souls, the idea that people alive today are the reincarnated remnants of a civilization destroyed tens of thousands of years ago. The Bible is unambiguous here. Hebrews 9:27 states plainly that it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment. There is one life, one death, one judgment. Not a cycle of return and refinement, not a spiritual evolution across multiple existences. The salvation the Scripture describes is not the product of accumulated wisdom across lifetimes. It is the gift of grace received through faith in a single historical moment, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Ephesians 2:8-9 does not leave room for interpretation. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. We receive this clearly. The spiritual dimension of Cayce's framework, wherever it relies on reincarnation or cosmic soul evolution, does not hold under biblical scrutiny. We set it aside, not dismissively, but because the truth matters more than the narrative. What remains after that filtering, however, is still remarkable. What remains is a man who described physical events, geological events, geopolitical shifts, and specific geographical changes with a precision that has no comfortable rational explanation, and it is those physical predictions, stripped of their New Age theological scaffolding, that demand our attention in 2025. Now we open the file. Now we look at the map. Begin with the west coast of the United States. For years, geological science has discussed what it calls the big one, the catastrophic earthquake that the San Andreas fault system has been building toward for decades. Cayce's vision was more specific and more unsettling than anything the scientific establishment has publicly modeled. He did not simply describe an earthquake. He described a breakup. In one of his most cited readings, he stated clearly that Los Angeles and San Francisco would be among the areas destroyed, and that this destruction would come even before the changes he foresaw on the East Coast. He described the land of California breaking apart, not simply shaking, but fundamentally fragmenting. The modern geological record does not contradict this. The stress accumulation along the Pacific coastal fault systems is measurable, documented, and by every scientific metric, overdue for release. The Cascadia subduction zone, which runs from Northern California to British Columbia, is capable of producing a magnitude 9 earthquake followed by a tsunami that modeling suggests could be catastrophic beyond anything in recorded American history. Cayce connected the volatility of the West Coast not merely to geology, but to what he saw as a profound disconnection, a civilization of extraordinary material sophistication built over a land with deep historical significance, with no awareness of or accountability to anything beyond the visible and immediate. Whether you read this in his spiritual terms or simply in terms of a culture that has systematically refused to reckon with its own fragility, the observation has a sharp edge. He warned specifically to watch the volcanoes, Vesuvius and Pelée, as triggering indicators. He said that significant activity in those volcanic systems could precede corresponding seismic events on the American West Coast within roughly 3 months. In 2025, the Ring of Fire has been notably active. The geological indicators are not quiet. Move now to the East Coast. If the West Coast prophecy describes a slow, grinding breakup, the East Coast prophecy is something different in character. It is sudden. Cayce spoke of the disappearance of land. He described changes that would come in the twinkling of an eye, a phrase borrowed directly from 1 Corinthians 15:52, where Paul uses it to describe the speed of the resurrection transformation. The borrowing of that language is interesting in itself, whether intentional or not, because Paul's point in that passage is precisely about transformation that is both instantaneous and irreversible. Cayce described something similar in the physical realm, changes so rapid that the gradual models of climate science would be simply inadequate to predict or prevent them. He spoke of a pole shift, a literal slipping of the Earth's crust over its core, producing a sudden redistribution of ocean water across coastlines. New York, the center of global finance, a symbol of the accumulated power of the old economic order, sits in what he described as a specific zone of vulnerability. He spoke of the Atlantic coastline receding significantly. Whether this is read spiritually or geologically, the observation aligns with documented concerns about sea level instability and tectonic stress along the eastern seaboard. The picture in Europe is equally stark. Cayce described the map of northern Europe changing drastically, land sinking in the north and rising in the south. He spoke of upheavals in both the Arctic and Antarctic regions, creating cascading effects, volcanic activity in equatorial zones, pole movement driven by the redistribution of ice mass weight, and the fundamental redrawing of northern European coastal geography. He specifically named England, Scandinavia, and the low-lying lands of the northern European plain as areas of significant change. The irony is that the very mechanisms he described, ice loss driving crustal rebound and stress redistribution, are precisely the processes that modern glaciologists are now measuring and modeling. He described it from his chair in Virginia Beach, decades before the instruments existed to confirm what he saw. And then comes the twist. The part of the Cayce material that surprises almost everyone who encounters it for the first time, and that no political commentator or mainstream analyst has ever been able to fully account for. Where did Cayce identify as the places of safety? Before we go any further, if you have not yet subscribed, do it right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. What we are about to cover in the next section is the part that almost never gets discussed, and it may be the most important information in this entire presentation. The first safe zone Cayce described was the American interior. Specifically, he pointed to a band of states, Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and the southern portions of Canada, as what he called the granary of the future. Geologically, this makes immediate sense. These regions sit on what scientists call the North American Craton, the oldest, densest, most seismically stable rock formation on the continent. While coastal regions fracture under tectonic stress, the ancient interior spine holds. Cayce saw these lands not merely surviving the coming changes, but becoming the agricultural and social foundation of a rebuilt civilization. The granary, the place where food grows and communities are rebuilt. This is not an abstract spiritual vision. It is a geographical and agricultural prediction that any reasonable geologist or agricultural scientist would look at and find difficult to simply dismiss. The second safe zone is the one that has confused and frustrated political analysts for decades, precisely because it cuts against every comfortable ideological assumption of the Western world. Cayce pointed to Russia. In one of his most discussed and most debated readings, he described Russia as the hope of the world, not in the political sense, not tied to any particular government or economic system, but in terms of the spiritual and moral character that he believed would emerge from that land after its own great purifications. He explicitly distinguished this from communism or Bolshevism, which he saw as a phase rather than a destiny. He described a Russia that would eventually build its civilization around the principle of one human being living for the good of another, a principle that, stated in those terms, is not foreign to the Sermon on the Mount. And he foresaw, remarkably, a genuine friendship developing between a healed America and a renewed Russia as one of the foundations of a new global stability. Whatever we make of that politically, and it is undeniably provocative in the context of 2025, the underlying principle is worth sitting with. Cayce was not predicting geopolitical outcomes. He was describing what he believed was the spiritual gravity of a landmass and its people, forged through suffering and loss into something that the comfortable West had not been required to develop. History is not without examples of this dynamic. The Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Rome from the margins, not the center. The early Christian community did not emerge from the halls of power. It emerged from people who had nothing left to trust but God. Now we have the outline of the map. The coasts carry the weight of warning. The interior holds the promise of stability. The geopolitical poles, by Cayce's reading, are in the process of a slow reversal that will accelerate in the years ahead. And the two places he identified as the unexpected foundations of what comes next are not the places the old world would have chosen. I want to stay with this map for a moment, not to produce fear, but to look at it honestly, because the natural human response to a map like this is the survival instinct. It is the voice that says to sell, to move, to hoard, to fortify. It is the voice that has been driving a significant portion of the preparedness industry for the last decade. And while prudent preparation is not foolishness, the book of Proverbs spends considerable time commending the wisdom of the ant who stores food for winter. Cayce's deepest point in all of this was not logistical, it was something more fundamental. In the closing moments of his most urgent readings, when desperate people asked him directly, "How do we survive? What do we do? Where do we go?" Cayce did not hand them a shopping list. He gave them a principle. Spirit is the life, he said. Mind is the builder. The physical is the result. In other words, the map of physical probability you are looking at right now is not the final reality. It is the output of a much deeper process. It is what the collective moral and spiritual orientation of a civilization produces in the physical world. The biblical parallel here is not obscure. The scripture is full of the principle that what happens in the visible world is the downstream consequence of what is happening in the invisible one. As a man thinks in his heart, so he is, Proverbs 23:7 tells us. The physical is the result, This is not positive thinking in the shallow commercial sense. This is the deep architectonic principle of a universe created and sustained by a personal God who is not indifferent to the moral and spiritual choices of the people he made. Cayce's warning, stripped of its New Age overlay and held up to biblical light, resolves into something recognizable and true. The ultimate safe zone is not geographical. Geography matters. The craton is real. The coastal fault lines are real. The glacial melt-driving polar instability is measurable and documented. But the deepest safety is the kind described in Psalm 91. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. That is not a metaphor for passive spiritual niceness. It is a description of a specific kind of person, someone whose orientation is toward God, whose choices are shaped by that orientation, whose life is built on something that the earthquake cannot shake. Jesus ended the Sermon on the Mount with exactly that image, the man who built his house on rock versus the man who built on sand. The storm came for both of them equally. Only one house stood. The people Cayce most consistently described as protected were not the ones who had the best bunkers or the most remote properties. They were the ones who were, as he put it, in alignment, people who received what seemed to be inexplicable guidance. A sudden urge to visit family in another state 3 days before a disaster. A missed flight that turned out to be a mercy. An unexpected job offer that moved them to a new city before they understood why. This is not the language of cosmic luck. For a person of faith, this is the language of providence, the active personal guidance of a God who knows the end from the beginning and who has promised in Romans 8:28 that he works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. This is not a passive promise, it is conditional on a relationship, and relationships require engagement. The question Cayce's earth change prophecies ultimately force us to ask is not, where should I move? It is, who am I becoming? What are the values that organize my life? Am I building something that can withstand what is coming, or am I invested in structures, financial, social, spiritual, that the scripture itself has already told us are temporary? The writer of Hebrews described the whole process of human history as a shaking. Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven. And then, having said that, he makes the interpretive point explicit. This expression, yet once more, denotes the removing of those things which can be shaken as of created things, so that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. The shaking in the biblical framework is not the end of the story. It is the clarification of the story. It removes what is temporary so that what is permanent can be seen. The earth changes Cayce described, interpreted through that lens, are not a catastrophe narrative, they are a clarification. The coastlines built on the most concentrated expressions of modern materialism and financial power are the most vulnerable. The interior lands, quieter, less celebrated, more dependent on soil and season and basic human cooperation, hold. The nations that have been forced by suffering to look for something beyond material prosperity begin to find it. And out of that combination of loss and discovery, something new is built. This is not a new story. It is the oldest story in the world, told again in the specific geography and geology of the 21st century. The book of Revelation describes a new heaven and a new earth, not the annihilation of the present order, but its transformation. The Apostle Peter, in his second letter, uses the language of the old world passing away, not into nothing but into something refined and renewed. The elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. But this burning is in the service of what he describes 2 verses later as a new heaven and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. The destination is not destruction. The destination is righteousness. Right relationship, right order, the alignment of human civilization with the character of the God who made it. Cayce saw, through whatever mechanism he was using, the outline of that transition. He saw the fracturing of what could not hold and the survival of what had been built on more durable foundations. He saw the suffering that precedes the new and the possibility of a world organized around something better than profit and dominance. His framework for explaining what he saw was not biblical. It was drawn from a mix of sources that the scripture would not endorse. But the shape of what he saw rhymes in remarkable ways with what the scripture itself describes as the trajectory of history. That is the thing about truth. It has a way of showing up even in imperfect containers. So what do we do with this? If you are watching this, reading this, sitting with the discomfort and the weight of everything we have laid out, what does any of it require of you? It does not require you to sell your house tomorrow. It does not require you to move to Ohio or to look at Russia with sudden political sympathy. It does not require a specific address or a specific preparedness plan, though none of those things are inherently wrong. What it requires, if the pattern we have traced through Cayce's readings and Scripture's framework is even approximately correct, is an honest reckoning with the question of what your life is actually built on, the same question Jesus asked on a hillside 2,000 years ago, using the same image of a storm coming equally for everyone, and the only variable being what was underneath. The geological record is real. The tectonic stress along the Pacific and Atlantic coasts is measurable. The polar magnetic drift is documented. The social and economic fracturing of the present moment is visible to anyone willing to look. Edgar Cayce mapped these things from his chair in Virginia Beach with a precision that still does not have a satisfying conventional explanation. Whatever we believe about the mechanism he used, the map he produced is worth taking seriously. But the map is not the